Hello and welcome to this special show on CNBC-TV18. I'm Ekta Batra and with me is Mr. Umang Vohra of Cipla. We are at their heritage office in Bombay Central, and as you can see behind me, it is the office where Mahatma Gandhi has come personally and has met the management, has met Dr. Hamid. Mr. Vohra, thank you very much for joining in. You know, we are in such a historical place. Can you start by telling us about this story and where we are?
So this, I think, goes back to 1939. I know that at that time, it was Dr. Hamid and his father, and I think Mahatma Gandhi ji came here in 1939, and his whole emphasis was self-sufficiency for India. Cipla had just started. He actually walked into this office. It pretty much stays the way it is. And I think from that point in time, Cipla's mission became self-sufficiency, caring for life, and that's how we took birth. That's how this company was formed. So there's tremendous energy here, Ekta. This is, we pretty much kept most of how the office, the buildings used to exist. And we draw a lot of inspiration from this place.
So this is where Dr. Hamid comes. Does he go to the Lower Parel office, which is the new Cipla, the more modern Cipla?
Well, Dr. Hamid's as modern as one can be. You should see him with his smartphones and everything else, but he prefers to sit here. This is his office. You know, this is also the office where our India team sits, our India marketing team sits. You know, we have actually quite a number of people who sit here.
But this also talks about, you know, Dr. Hamid's comfort zone and somewhere his legacy as well, with the vintage cars and the statues and the beautiful paintings, which we'll see in just a bit. But it talks about his comfort zone as a person and his focus of what Cipla was, the history of Cipla, the Swadeshi Robin Hood, might you say. But now we have Lower Parel, which is a new swanky office, and it talks about a whole new world that Cipla is in, which is the US markets, which is growing India. What is Cipla as we know today?
So Cipla is the combination of, you know, if I put three things, it's the combination of legacy that basically says, we arrive when people need us, whether it's self-sufficiency, whether it's caring for AIDS, whether it's during COVID. So we are always there. The second thing that Cipla is it's a company that's trying to keep up with time and ahead of time, right? And therefore you have, you know, as you're rightly pointing out, there's a juxtaposition of this office, the Lower Parel office, our choices of markets, right? And the third thing that, you know, we largely are is a company that works with the heart of a foundation. And so, you know, if you combine these three somewhere, a company that's trying to keep ahead of science, a company that's trying to keep ahead of current times, a very rich legacy, purpose, as well as just the ability to, you know, make a difference to people's lives, that is what Cipla is.
But that also brings me to the question of what the future of Cipla is, right? Because that's the big question, the succession plan. There's been so much speculation about whether or not Cipla is on the block, whether the deal will go through. What can we expect? I know you're a part of the company and not a part of the promoter entity, but can you clear the air for us?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to. You know, whatever we do is public. The company's maintained that this is a speculative sort of information that's around in the marketplace. The company doesn't comment on it. The promoters have not commented on it. You know, we respond to what we do as a company through various statutory, you know, announcements, etc. There has been none, right? You know, as of 2 days back, we also opened the window for our employees. So I think people could infer, right, that things are, you know, based on all of this, that, you know, it seems like it's business in Cipla. I don't think we're not part, it doesn't seem like we're part of any transaction, otherwise we wouldn't have opened the window.
Okay, but what about the future of Cipla? Because Dr. Hamid obviously must be thinking about what he wants to do next.
Yes. And
where he wants to leave Cipla. What do you think is probably the most feasible option for him, or what he's most comfortable with? A PE, a promoter entity, or maybe the second generation running it?
You know, I think it's difficult for me to, you know, try to unravel the depths of Dr. Hamid's experience, mind, thinking at this point in time. I can only tell you what I pick up, right, from him. I think he's most concerned about Cipla. right? And it doesn't matter to him, at least the way I've understood, about ownership. He just wants the ethos of Cipla to continue. And to a certain extent, he's relying tremendously on the management team to continue to do that. And he's pointed out several examples to me of how companies such as the Tata Sons, how companies such as Asian Paints, these continue to coexist through generations of promoters and generations of management, right? And so, in a sense, it's not Dr. Hamid's problem anymore. The way it's been told to me, it's become my problem now to ensure that the company continues to survive, continues to live, has succession of people in the management side. And as much as he plans for succession on the ownership side, I have to plan for succession on the management side. So it's a dual problem, and I think we're rested with it.
But in your personal opinion, what do you think is the best way for Cipla to carry on that ethos, to carry on that legacy, and to balance the idea of a Robin Hood Swadeshi as well as maybe a US-focused company?
Yeah, and so let's take the second part. It's easier to answer your question on that. Many years back, Ekta, I was asked, and Dr. Hamid's thing about Swadeshi, about the Robin Hood, essentially came out of his ability to bring drugs that were cheaper in the market in India. And so when the patent regime came into India and we began partnering with pharma companies, the pharma companies that I would go to present Cipla would ask me, why would we partner with you? You guys have always tried to bust our patents, right? And at that point in time, I said, look, Dr. Hamid's view has always been to ensure that drugs are available at affordable prices for Indians, right? And therefore, if we can cross is there a way in which we can dialogue with that objective in mind and your objective in mind? And then came this discussions on partnering, which we've done several of. So I think if we elevate the problem to a stage which is devoid of positioning, right? I'd like to believe that Cipla arrives when it's required to, right? So it arrived to fight the patent regime, it arrived to create a partnership of sorts with MNCs. It's arrived during COVID, it's arrived during AIDS, right? So we take a human problem and we try and solve around it. And I think that is what, I would think that's what he wants Cipla to continue to do.
So big shoes to fill. The current name which is doing the rounds, does that continue to be on the cards?
The current name?
Torrent Pharma.
Well, it's again speculative, right? Again, I would say that we've opened the window, right? I think people should infer from that the company has obviously taken conscious calls on how it would proceed, and it respects all kinds of governance and statutory obligations.
So you did manage, you actually hived off your generics business by a slump sale. What's the reason for that? Are you probably looking to maybe get a strategic investor in, monetize it?
Not really. I don't think we have any such plan. We just think that the way we are looking at our business, the generic business, and it's very interesting, Ekta, and thank you for asking that question. We see a huge amount of growth coming in India from tier 2 to 6, right? And actually, over a period of time, we think that growth is going to be more significant than what we will see in metros and tier 1s. And if you just follow the cues, look at the number of private equity investments going into hospitals, which are for tier 2 to 6 cities, right? So Blackstone did CARE. Yesterday, somebody did hospitals in Kanpur and beyond, right? And I think that's the thread we're following. And we just think that distribution is very different, is a different kind of a distribution compared to our metro distribution. Both must coexist in our One India framework. Right? But I think it's better for this entity, right, to be housed in a different place, because we don't want to be in a situation where we're trying to view everything necessarily as one, when actually there are differences that exist in how these companies could work and structure.
So I'll just get to the India business, because that's very interesting with trade generics and generic companies as well. But before that, the other point of view is that maybe Cipla is too large to run as a single entity, and the best way to probably run it is to break it up into different businesses. Is that a thought which has ever crossed the management's mind, that the US will probably be more efficient as a standalone entity, India separate?
The board in its mandate always considers these things, right? Some of it is linked to the type of customers we serve. A lot of it is linked to the success factors that make each business run. And the third part is really about how is it best governed, right? And it's the board's prerogative. Management can suggest various ways of doing this. But we were a 13,000 crore company. We're now a 25, hopefully closing at a 25+ thousand this year. So the company's operations have doubled, right? And that's on top line. But if you look at volumes, that's really gone up significantly. So I would not rule out any of this happening in the future, right? As we try to become more efficient on capital allocation, as we try and begin to look at ways to run the business. That doesn't mean it's imminent, right? But I'm sure the board in its wisdom would continue that.
So maybe sell a part of the business which is not as efficient as the others.
I don't think we would ever sell any business at this stage.
Or get a strategic investor?
I'm not even sure it's so much about a strategic investor. I think it's a little bit more about what's the best way to run the company, right? Cipla has never actually been a company that's run for valuation, right? So the whole concept of trying to take to the board an idea of a strategic investor to boost valuations, I'm not sure that the board would be conducive, and they would be shocked if I brought a proposal like that to them, to be honest.
Okay, now coming back to India, because what you mentioned with regards to the tier 2 to tier 6 growth is extremely interesting, but because we have an influx of genericized medicine coming into that space as well, trade generics, we have multiple companies entering that space. How much of a growth driver do you think it will be, and how important is it? What are the estimates in terms of growth as well?
So I think that if the India, let's just say overall India growth settles in at broadly 10 to 12%, right? I think the growth on the tier 2 to 6 side should be at least 200, 300 basis higher than that, right? And if you look at the volume numbers of India, that's huge, right? We're talking about 1.5 billion people. I would imagine tier 2 to 6 is about 600, 700 million people or more, right? I'm going to think that growing at 15% is huge.
Okay.
Right? So I think this is a huge, huge opportunity for India to grow this high. I think the big differentiating thing about India, and actually more at a company level, Ekta, what we're trying to do is we've either got to be differentiated because of technology, or we've got to be differentiated because of our reach. Now, tier 2 to 6 is clearly a reach problem, right? And we, that's again for reach, you're right. And then we have a third problem, which is differentiation because of brands, right? So you and I, when we have breakfast in the morning, we have certain brands in our mind that we'll eat, and I think that's the positioning we want. So if we can get 70 or 75% of Cipla's revenues to be comprised of either differentiated technology, inhalers, peptides, whatever it may be, an equal amount, may not be 75, but at least 35% of it be differentiated reach. And if we have big brands that occupy 40, 50% of our revenue, we are talking about a very secure organization with a very secure brand thesis for almost, I'd like to believe, 70% of revenues, right? And that's the quest that we are on.
But is competition biting at your heels now?
Definitely. And I think it's good that this competition bites at our heels. We bite at their heels in certain therapies, they bite at our heels. I think the market is huge for everyone, right? We have market share pressures, they have market share pressures, but I think India is such a unique place where there's growth happening. And there's so much of learning. We learn a lot from our competitors.
But you have mentioned in the past that you can't pull down prices so much in the Indian markets because eventually it's going to impact quality. What are your thoughts on that? And do you think that that's the reason we've had so many of these quality issues, which has probably dented our image on a global scale?
Yes. I think it's a mix of 2 or 3 things. We are very entrepreneurial as a race. All of us in India are extremely entrepreneurial as a race. Very often we try to get ahead of ourselves, right, without making sure, because the basic principle of Jugaad is to solve a particular thing and move ahead, right? I think where we are on the world stage now is to appreciate the fact that a Jugaad has linkages with several other elements of the chain, right? And I think it's a realization that we are all going through as a country. So regulation has to coexist with growth, has to coexist with quality, has to coexist with governance, has to coexist with equality, inclusion, all of that, right? And I think that's the new mantra that probably India Inc. is getting used to now, right? And so, yes, so that's one. One is entrepreneurship. I think the second is really the ability for regulators to enforce regulation, right? So if you really look at it, you know, many times the media reports, FDA has visited this plant, right? There has to be similar kind, may not be the similar fear, but there has to be a similar kind of respect, right? And a similar kind of thesis, right? Even for other regulators. It doesn't just have to be the US regulator, right?
Indian regulators.
Indian regulators. It should be, you know, the others. And I think that's the other second part, that lift the industry's understanding to a level where even the regulators within that country create the same amount of emphasis. And the third is really, you know, India is represented, our market is represented 30%, 40% by the really big companies. But there's 60% who are smaller companies. And I think the nature of the industry is how can the 30% or 40% help the other 60%, right? And I think that is the big challenge. Can we actually do a lot more? Can we help them, you know, develop their quality systems a lot more?
So you mentioned the word regulator. I'm going to ask you about Indore and Goa. That's my cue. Regulatory issues on both of these facilities, extremely important plans for you all. When is the remediation expected to be completed, and when can we see it out of the woods?
So both of them are at different time points, right? Not the most ideal situation to be in at a point that we are. But let's say in Goa, we are about a year, about 14, 16 months from our last audit, right? Usually the FDA comes back within 20 to 24 months to come back and audit. I do expect that we would possibly be re-audited in Goa in the next 6 months. I'd like to believe that by December we'd be ready for that, right? If not already. Indore is slightly longer because their last inspection was in February. And I think if we can possibly get re-audited by next year, possibly July, August, that'll be great. But the remediation in Indore will also be over around the July time period.